I'm John Burnham Schwartz, Literary Director of the Sun Valley Writers Conference, and this is Beyond the Page. In this episode, Scott Moyers, the publisher of Penguin Press, sits down with his author Roger McNamee, the noted tech venture capitalist, early mentor to Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook investor, who went from being a founding supporter of the world's biggest and most profitable social media company to becoming one of its most influential critics. Facebook's business model, its vision of itself as a news and information platform devoid of social responsibility, its use of data mining and AI, its pervasive influence on our culture and politics. As you'll see, there's nothing the charismatic McNamee isn't willing to discuss, including his own adventures at the birth of big tech.
Hi there, this is Scott Moyers. I'm a friend of the Sun Valley Writers Conference, and I'm delighted to participate in this installment of the series of literary conversations, SVWC Now, a talk with Roger McNamee.
Great to be here, Scott.
You are a very noted tech investor. I think of there's a very famous quote of Upton Sinclair's, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." I think one of the things I really admire about you is you had every reason not to turn against Facebook, and yet you did. I wonder if you could explain how you got to that moment of turning.
So, Scott, it's absolutely true. For 30 years or more, I was a relentless technology optimist. I was lucky enough to arrive in Silicon Valley as the personal computer industry was beginning. And I grew up with Steve Jobs and Bill Gates before they were billionaires and got to enjoy the era when Silicon Valley was in the business of enabling its customers. The technology, in Steve Jobs' parlance, was a bicycle for the mind. It was not just good for you, it was fun. And so that era really formed my whole view of the world. And when I knew Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg best, which was from 2006 to 2009, I had a great relationship with them. I liked them very much. And Facebook in those days was doing something that I thought was really valuable for society. It was requiring authenticated identity from every single user. And it was giving them control of their privacy. And I thought, wow, if they're going to do these two things, they're not just going to be the first social network that mattered. They were going to do it the right way. I stopped being active there in 2009, which was several years before they evolved the business model for which they're famous today. And candidly, I just wasn't paying attention. Things were going on in Silicon Valley. The culture was changing. And that idealism, the empowerment mantra that was so central to my enthusiasm, was being eaten away as the power of computers and the power of global networks allowed companies to create predatory business models. And I'm thinking here of companies like Spotify, which took advantage of the ignorance of musicians, or Uber, which took advantage of the ignorance of drivers, or Airbnb, which took advantage of basically rule breaking in the hotel business. And I just got really sick of it. So I decided to quit. And what happened was, when I retired from investing, about a month later, I'm on Facebook because I love Facebook. And all of a sudden, I start seeing things that really disturb me. Initially in the Democratic primary for the 2016 election. It's January, and I'm seeing hate speech from fans of Bernie Sanders targeting Hillary Clinton, spreading on Facebook virally, which suggested people were spending money to spread that stuff. And all of a sudden, my instincts as an analyst kicked in. And I didn't know what it meant. But soon I saw a thing related to Black Lives Matter that was a violation of the civil rights laws. And then in June of 2016, the UK voted on Brexit. And that was the first time when I realized that the same tools that make advertisers so successful on Facebook could be used to interfere in an election. And I totally freaked out. I started looking for allies. I went around to people who were like tech journalists and said, "Hey, are you seeing any of this?" And none of them were. In fact, they really didn't care until the news came out about Paul Manafort and the Russians. And then Walt Mossberg, the famous Walt Mossberg, partner of Kara Swisher, founder of Recode, invites me to do an op-ed. And I'd never written an op-ed before. I had no idea what I was doing. And it took me more than a month to get it done. And on October 30th of 2016, so 9 days before the election, my wife suggested I send the draft op-ed to my friends, my former mentees, Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, and see if I can't persuade them to make changes. Because what I was seeing was a platform where the culture, the algorithms, and the business model would let bad actors, like the Russians maybe, do great harm to innocent people. And I couldn't believe that Mark and Sheryl would be comfortable with that. And it occurred to me that they were probably the victims. So I sent this thing to them, and they both responded immediately. But it was kind of like, Roger, we totally take care of all this stuff. It was sort of classic Facebook, an apology and a promise to do better. But they handed me off to one of their colleagues. And for several days in a row after that, I'm begging him to do the right thing. Then the election happens, and at that point, I start screaming. And this goes on for 3 months. And I'm basically going, you guys have undermined Brexit. You've undermined the US presidential election. And you may not have done it on purpose, but it was a consequence of your business model. Well, they just blew me off. And that, Scott, is when I was faced with this moral dilemma. I'm retired. Maybe I just say this is somebody else's problem. But for whatever reason, my value system couldn't allow me to sit back quietly. And so I decided to become an activist, which was not a role that I ever anticipated having.
And was that uncomfortable for you in terms of the community you were living in?
I had a huge advantage. So the answer is, of course it was. I mean, most of the people that I'd spent my professional life with viewed me as having done something that violated the values of Silicon Valley. So, in a sense, I was a traitor, right? Many of them just thought I was nuts. But whatever it was something that I shouldn't be doing, that I should just quietly accept that I'd been a participant, I'd made money from this, and I should just let them go about their business, be retired. But here's the thing. I began my career as an investor in the public market and in mutual funds at T. Rowe Price. And the truth is, if you have to have the support of everybody around you, if you're not comfortable being different, you're never going to be a great public market investor. So I was already comfortable with the notion that everybody was going to disagree with me. Was it disappointing? Oh, God, yes. I basically threw away 34 years of relationships, and not all of them. But the really cool thing is, Scott, I've got a lot of new friends that I didn't have before. And the experience on balance has been massively frustrating because, I set out to warn the world about what had happened in 2016 to make sure we didn't repeat it in 2020. And sadly, the exact same stuff is happening again. Different players, slightly more evolved techniques, but, disinformation completely dominated the Democratic primary, and it completely dominates COVID. We can't have a rational public health response because it's become part of the culture war. And that is infuriating.
Now, Roger, one of the most impressive to me things about the achievement of the book is that you were sort of building the plane while you were flying it. You were living this new role and learning and gathering allies and perpetrating your activism, even as you were narrativizing it. And I observed you do this in real time. It was very impressive. So can you just give us a sense for what that's been like to be in the middle of this particular storm and what you think the good has been and what have been the happy surprises and what have been the sort of unpleasant surprises?
The thing about writing the book was when you and I first got together, we had an arc in our mind for what the story was that was really about the 2016 election. It was about, for the most part, it was about democracy and about brain hacking, this notion that they can use individual targeting and the massive data they've collected, which is essentially a data voodoo doll on each one of us, to manipulate what our attention sees and therefore what our choices are. That's what the initial focus was. And we were aware, maybe I'd given you 4 chapters when Cambridge Analytica broke. And Cambridge Analytica, I believe, starts at chapter 7 of the book. So I caught up to it while it was going on. And the only 2 chapters that you rejected were the first 2 chapters on Cambridge Analytica, because I had steam coming out of my ears. I was so angry. And you went, Roger, this tone is not going to work. And made me rewrite them both, which I'm really glad I did. But as you know, the story didn't stop when we submitted the final draft that went in to be typeset for the hardcover. In fact, all hell was breaking loose while that was going on. And we wound up writing a chapter after the midterms that we stuck onto the end of it. And it consciously, because the story was just still playing out. And then when I started my book tour, a whole new set of things happened. And it became incredibly obvious that this book is something I could update every 3 or 4 months. In fact, if we wanted to, we could add a bunch to it now. What's so clear, what I tried to do is to use a memoir format to make this accessible to everybody. There have been insider books. There have been, sort of TikToks, blow by blow of how some of the startups worked. There have been books written by academics. And this is essentially, because I used the memoir form and because I was there in the early days and because I've been around Silicon Valley forever, we were able to do something that used the narrative of my discovery as the narrative of the book. And so the book teases out the thing, not from a perspective of knowing all the answers and then trying to explain them to you, but the early chapters were written in complete ignorance of what I knew 5 chapters later. And we didn't go back and change that.
So I think a lot of people are sympathetic to not seeing this coming, but fewer and fewer people are sympathetic the more the evidence mounts. And I remember you telling me way early on that the big game is the hearts and minds of the employees within Silicon Valley who don't want to work for evil companies. We've seen some of that dis-ease within Facebook just recently. How do you think that's going, and where is it going? The hearts and minds battle within this community.
So when I began my activism, my goal was to persuade the founders, right? So Mark Zuckerberg or the founders of Google to change, because they're the ones with total control. So if you can move their hearts and minds, you're done, right? So after them, the employees have the next most leverage. You can't run these companies without the employees. But I think it's fair to say that until the last 12 months, the employees were every bit as much a part of the problem as the founders. Think about Facebook. I'm not aware of any employees who publicly voiced any concern about the role the company played in the interference in Brexit, the role it played in the interference in the 2016 election. I'm not aware of anyone expressing any concerns about enabling the genocide in Myanmar. I'm not aware of anybody being concerned about the role Facebook played in the terrorism in Christchurch, New Zealand. Basically, the only thing Facebook employees had ever pushed back on was the use of arbitration in sexual harassment cases for employees inside the company. Until now. And what happened here is, I think the last 2 months have crystallized in the minds of a set of people who previously were ignorant of it, the role that Facebook, but also YouTube and Twitter and Instagram play in essentially amplifying the most harmful messages in society. And it came to a head because Twitter, a business which for all intents and purposes was made by the Trump presidency. Trump's use of Twitter made Twitter the centerpiece of journalism. It really replaced the Associated Press as the heartbeat of journalism. And so in that context, Twitter basically just let Trump do whatever he wanted. And then suddenly a few weeks ago, they, for the very first time, fact-checked a couple of Trump tweets. Now keep in mind, Trump has had literally, I believe, thousands of tweets that were filled with lies. But they finally fact-checked 2 of them. And then the next day, they did something even more astonishing. They put a public safety warning when he was talking about looters and shooters and effectively inciting violence. That was a really crystallizing moment because Facebook employees had the exact same messages had been circulated on Facebook. And Mark Zuckerberg had come out and said, we're not going to fact check or edit or censor the President of the United States. And on the public safety one, I think a lot of people just went, well, hang on a minute. Inciting violence is not why we're here. And so a few hundred people staged a virtual walkout. Now, what we don't know is how many people actually strongly hold a view and what they're willing to do about it. Because the sad truth is Silicon Valley, because right now it's dominated by a handful of monopolists, is a place where if you get a reputation as a rabble-rouser, you're not going to be welcome at most of the other big companies. And so I'm concerned that this will be like the Google employee walkout of a year ago. One of those things where there's a moment of heat, but no light, that they will quash this very effectively. They have surveillance on their employees that you just wouldn't believe. And they have a lot of tools in their tool chest for suppressing dissent, just as Google went and systematically got rid of all of the people who organized the walkout there. And so I think it remains to be seen. And the question is, do the employees respond to that by becoming more proactive on these issues, or do they retreat defensively and simply put up with it? The one thing I know is that Facebook's ability to recruit has been badly harmed over the last 12 months. College kids who used to view Facebook as one of the top 2 or 3 places in the country to go work now view it way, way, way down the list. In fact, many people hold a very negative view of it. And in the long run, that's going to be an issue for them. But I think the problem they face today is, for the first time, I think this is percolated out into the population as a whole. I think that we saw in Georgia more than 1 million people turned up for a primary where the active voter suppression was so extreme, it was designed to have 1/3 that many people vote. And people stood in line for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours to vote. People are really, really concerned about the state of the country right now. And I believe that if you went and polled those people that stood in line, whether they think Facebook has anything to do with the problems we're dealing with right now, that a majority of them would tell you yes. And that suggests, as Biden's statement that Facebook needs to be reformed suggests, that if there is a change in administration, Facebook's undisguised bet on Trump may prove to be a big political issue. Now, they have a huge Washington operation. They spread money around like the best lobbyists you can imagine. And so, I don't think, they still have all the tools, but they've really harmed their brand here. And here's what's really sad and weird about it. Facebook has been a great tool during the pandemic for staying in touch. But it has, at the same time, also been the go-to tool for organizing the quarantine liberation movement, for organizing the anti-vax movement, and for absolutely stigmatizing public health solutions like masks, all of which are, horrible for public health and are views that are not only not held by a majority of the country, they're held by a very small minority who, because of the way Facebook works, because of the way Twitter and YouTube work, their voice appears to be much greater than their numbers.
Well, I'm encouraged by your optimism. Though it's a certain kind of optimism, I suppose, that says the crisis is so acute that reality can't be denied. I mean, that's part of what I'm hearing as your optimism.
Hang on. Let's break that up for just a moment. I mean, I think one can argue, I have certainly been arguing for 4 years, that the crisis in democracy and the crisis in public health relative to the way children were being manipulated and harmed by the addictive properties of social media platforms, the ability of bullies to harm other kids, that those things were already at crisis level. And what we were having was a struggle to get people to attribute the responsibility. I would argue, and you and I have talked about this, it's in the book, that internet platforms are really important to our economy. The internet and technology in general are super important. And the country has faced this kind of challenge before. In 1960, we finally realized that the chemicals industry, which in the 50s was really the internet of that economy. Remember, I mean, if you go watch The Graduate, even in 65, they're talking plastics, right? I mean, the reason that that industry was so profitable and so rapid growing was they could pour their waste products anywhere. They would dump toxic chemicals into the atmosphere. They would pour mercury into fresh water and not bear any of the cost or any of the consequences. So the country bore the cost of public health crisis and environmental damage. In 1960, we start to pass the legislation that shifts the incentives and shifted accountability. We did the same thing in 1906 with the Pure Food and Drug Act, because people before that were making drugs and promising the moon, right? Everything was hydroxychloroquine, right? They would say this is a miracle cure, even though it might kill you. It might have actual mercury in it, or it would have, heroin or cocaine in it. And we said you got to establish safety and efficacy before you can put a drug out. And the building trades in the 1880s, after the big fires, we put accountability to the people who built houses. We said, look, you got to build them to a certain standard. And if you fail, you're accountable. Now, we need to do this with tech companies. We can't have tech companies just shipping products when they think they're done. I mean, look at what's going on in facial recognition. The implicit bias in those systems, particularly in law enforcement, was having a massive harmful effect on people of color. And in employment situations, not just people of color, but also on women. AI as a concept, as applied to facial recognition, as applied to things like employment, as applied to housing. In those areas, the data sets used to train the artificial intelligence were based on things full of bias. And so that bias was carried over, but buried inside a black box that was inscrutable. And there's no accountability, no responsibility. And I think we have to shift that. And what I love about the crisis we're facing now is that the connection between the business model of internet platforms and the politicization of public health could not be more clear. It is unambiguous. And as a consequence, if we get a different administration, and that different administration is trying to be responsive to the legitimate civil rights issues being raised by these protests, to the legitimate issues about how we run our healthcare system, given how frail it has been in a pandemic, given the really obvious flaws in our economy, where we've outsourced a gazillion jobs and created a supply chain so fragile that a small disruption from public health completely paralyzed it. When we're going to look for, well, what do we do instead? The one thing we shouldn't do is let the tech guys lead us out of this.
Now, in terms of the leverage to start achieving some of those things, I mean, one fear on the other side is that this crisis is just accelerating the digitalization of everything, and it further empowering the FANG companies, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netscape, Google.
Sure.
These companies are only getting aggrandizing power. I mean, Amazon, just one obvious example. So given the relationship between that kind of economic power and political leverage, does that mean we folks have to work twice as hard? I mean, what is the ultimate net, the balance here?
Well, Before the murder of George Floyd, all the signs were that the big tech companies were going to emerge from the pandemic much stronger than they went in, right? Far stronger. And that efforts like contact tracing were being used as an excuse for them to extend their surveillance into places that previously didn't exist, with technologies that can't possibly work for contact tracing, but work great for gathering data. I was so depressed. We didn't happen to talk that week. But when George Floyd was murdered, it triggered a popular revolt, a peaceful popular revolt that is questioning the things that I have been questioning, not just in my book, but in my daily activities about, is the country following a good direction? And the COVID pandemic exposed the flaws in the economic model we were using, the version of capitalism we had where all the benefits went to a tiny percent of the population. That clearly broke completely when the supply chains broke. Our healthcare system, right? Employer-based healthcare stops working when unemployment's at 20 or 30%. And then you have the policing thing. And the policing thing was so clear. And the notion that DuVernay's film Selma, came out in front of this thing and everybody was able to watch it right after the protests began, and you got to see the accidental but very successful implementation of the principles of Martin Luther King to the same problem he applied it to just 50 years later. And you're seeing changes in attitudes that are so profound that it seems to me we shouldn't exclude the possibility that among the many things that get rethought will be our approach to capitalism, our approach to technology, our approach to healthcare, all of which I think we can safely say have contributed to making the problems we're dealing with now worse.
So, Roger, you've been meeting with all sorts of allies and potential allies and made some good friends, and there have been some strange bedfellows, I know. I'd be curious what you've learned. Maybe it's what let's just assume is the case in terms of political actors and their leverage points. But do you have any sort of surprises you can share with us as your Mr. Smith Goes to Washington adventures here?
So the piece that I really didn't understand before, Scott, was that our system was designed to prevent rapid change. It was designed to essentially be conservative and protect the status quo and to create lots of hurdles for change to make sure the country was actually embracing change before it could happen. So our system has lots of veto points in it. And over the last 50 years, we've added dozens more veto points. So there's one path to success and maybe 100 ways to veto it. And that created a paralysis. And, the topping point was this notion that the use of the filibuster to require 60 votes in the Senate to pass anything, which is clearly not something the framers intended. So we're at this point of paralysis, and I didn't understand that going in. I did not have high expectations for getting anything passed because there was almost no awareness of the problem when I began. So my expectations were not that we were going to get laws passed, but seeing where all the veto points are and watching Google and Facebook in particular exploit them, they are so good at it. I'll give you an example. If you look in academia at the people who do research on internet platforms, I'm going to guess that 95% or more are funded either directly or indirectly by Google and Facebook, and they know it.
I don't know that a lot of people really understand how the extent to which the pace of new business creation in tech in Silicon Valley has slowed as a result of these monopolies. Can you talk a little bit about that, their dead hand, and what the ultimate systemic effect of that is?
So basically, the effect of these companies on the market shows up in two different ways. The most successful strategy for somebody who is interested in creating a social platform or some new gee whiz AI technology is to create a business that you sell to Google, Facebook, or Amazon. And so you typically sell it very small for what is, in the larger context, a small amount of money. And then they take the parts of it that they like and they get rid of all the things that they don't like. That has been the driver of venture activity for a long time. And then you see people going way far afield, Uber, Airbnb, WeWork, and taking, if you will, the culture of Silicon Valley and applying it in a category that Facebook and Google and Amazon are not going to go into. That's where most of the unicorns came from. And most of those things are, really bad ideas that only worked because the capital markets had too much cash and the perceived risk of throwing $100 million or $1 billion at some startup run by a 24-year-old. That perceived risk was very low, and so people did it like crazy. What you really haven't seen, let me give you a super simple example. Everybody here, when you go into a subscription for the Wall Street Journal or whatever, runs into a Google product called CAPTCHA that says, "Are you a robot?" And you have to check off a box that says, "I am not a robot." And then they show you a bunch of pictures. And they're always things related to driving. So click on all the pictures that have a bicycle, or all the pictures that have a car, or all the pictures that have a stoplight or a stop sign. And they tell you that you're checking that off in order for them to determine you're a human. And that's not what they're doing at all. They figure out you're a human based on your mouse movement, how your hand moves. They just need the photographs to train the artificial intelligence for their self-driving cars. Now, here's the thing. Let's think about what Google would do with the data about your hand movement. They keep everything, so I assume they have a history of all of us based on every time we've done CAPTCHA. So if one day I were to develop Parkinson's disease or some other neurological disorder, where would it show up first? Would it be observable, or would it show up in my hand and mouse movement? Obviously, it's going to show up in the hand and mouse movement first. But here's the problem. In Google's business model, their customer for a piece of information like that is somebody who wants to buy certainty. And in our healthcare system, that's number one will be your health insurance company. Why? Because what they want to do is either raise your insurance rates or deny you coverage before a diagnosis is made. And it becomes a pre-existing condition that they cannot get rid of you for. Now, you sit there and go, well, hang on. Why wouldn't they create an insurance product that basically sat there and said, look, if you show any symptoms of a neurological disorder, we're going to alert you first thing. We're going to protect your privacy. We're going to give you a list of neurologists to go see. And you're going to pay us, depending on how old you are, increasing amounts of money to make sure that we capture this early before, it does any serious harm. Well, that model, that's not Google's model. There's no way they're doing that. And that thing can't come to market because Google's blocking the space. And Amazon's blocking the space. Amazon did a deal with the National Health Service in the UK to get tens of millions of people's personal health data, right? We have a law in the United States called HIPAA that in theory maintains privacy of our data. The problem is it doesn't cover prescriptions. It doesn't cover tests. Well, if you know everybody's prescriptions and their tests, you know what diseases they have. And that stuff is not being used to make your health better. It's being used for the benefit of insurance companies and drug companies. And I'm sitting there going, there's something really wrong with that, okay? And if you think about the present moment, the moment where millions of people are going into the street to peacefully demonstrate about police brutality, man, if we just said, hey, yo, while we're at it, we could change the healthcare system away from the ridiculous incentives we have today, right? And create an opportunity for alternative models of technology to come to market. That would be a really cool thing. And there are literally millions of examples like that. That one's so crystal clear, though.
Yeah. So such a great example that I just love to just pause on it a bit, because I think a lot of people would say, okay, well, now wait a minute. Surely there are laws that would prevent your insurer from, and surely people will say there is meaningful good that can come from harvesting data to predict things. If we can somehow build that firewall, if we can somehow, build a moat to keep the more baleful uses at bay.
Right.
And so I guess the question is obviously, I mean, do you have faith that sort of the bomber always gets through? That are you pessimistic that it's possible to keep?
No, the problem we have today is the economic incentives for doing harm are greater than the economic incentives for doing good. That the way the system works today, the protection of the rackets that exist with the monopolies in pharmaceuticals, with the oligopoly in healthcare insurance, and the incentives to deny coverage are so great. And the way the law works, it's so straightforward. As long as no diagnosis has been made, you can exclude somebody. And obviously, capture doesn't qualify as a medical diagnosis as currently constructed. And so we have to change the incentives. This is why I want to treat these guys the way we treated chemicals companies or the way we treated drug companies back in 1906, which is saying, look, you're really important, but we're not going to allow you to operate, without supervision, because your judgment is terrible. And when given a choice, what is the next thing you do? In Google's case, it's a smart cities project in Toronto, where they were literally going to replace self-determination, free will, if you will, and democracy with algorithms. Now, the city of Toronto, thanks to a group of activists, shut that down. So that was good news. But what was Facebook's strategy? They were going to invent a cryptocurrency called Libra that was designed to replace the pound and the dollar and the yen and the euro. And, that was a direct challenge to the sovereignty of nations, because nations only control two things, right? The legitimate use of force, military and police, and currency. So you take out one of those two things, and the thing is, Facebook has the scale that it was really easy to imagine them doing enormous harm and us allowing rich people to essentially move all of their money in a way that would not allow it to be taxed or controlled. And you might say to yourself, well, I like that. Or you might say, I really like smart cities. I really think it would be better to optimize cities for efficiency, even if that means everybody has to eat the same breakfast. And my point is, that's fine if we have a debate first and we have a real conversation. Everybody's up to speed and they know what we're making this decision about. When Toronto got that chance, they voted no. They didn't actually get to vote no, but they raised a big enough stink that Alphabet, the parent company of Google and Sidewalk Labs, withdrew the project.
We've been at we've been at the activist level, we've been at the policy level. Can you talk a bit about how people in their own lives can be more mindful of surveillance capitalism and being manipulated and just choices, reasonable choices that people have within their reach to maybe change their lives a bit?
So when I wrote the first draft and we published the hardcover edition of Zucked, I was persisting in the belief that each one of us had a role to play in our own behavior. I muted it in the hardcover from what the original viewpoint that I had was. And I abandoned it entirely in the revision of the paperback, because what's going on here is so manipulative. It is being imposed upon us. And it's being imposed throughout the economy in a way that a lot of people participate in. And as a consequence, I think the most important thing to do is to be informed about what the consequences are of the business model of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Twitter. And what that really means is I don't want people to feel guilty because they like Facebook, or feel guilty for liking Instagram or liking YouTube. But they do need to understand that if there is a video about a public health matter or a political matter on YouTube that is not sourced from one of the top 2 or 3 news organizations in the country, it is almost certainly disinformation. 90+% of what's on there is disinformation. Almost everything they're recommending is disinformation. Do not try to learn from YouTube unless you're going to Khan Academy or a New York Times video or something equivalent, a Guardian video. That's not what it's designed for. I would tell you that journalism is to the attention economy what journalism would be to Pornhub. It's the wrong setting. The attention economy undervalues fact. It undervalues truth and expertise. And so the most important thing for us to do is to recognize that expertise really matters. And if you want to see the consequences of not having expertise, look at our response to COVID. Look at our response to the economic decline we're having right now. We are literally operating with the worst possible responses to both of those things. And we're going to pay a price for that that's going to last a long time. And internet platforms are almost entirely responsible for our inability to deal with that. And so, number one issue, do not get your political information from social media. Just don't. You want to have a fight, an argument, God bless. But do not try to learn anything from it. Most of what's going on is disinformation, and an awful lot of it's designed to cause you to lose interest in democracy and to not vote. This is the year where everyone has to vote. Pick what you're going to vote for. That's your choice. But everybody should vote. If we do less than 70% turnout this time, we don't deserve to have a representative democracy. And that's my core message to people. Social media and democracy are incompatible. And that we have to decide as a culture what values we care about. Is the almighty buck going to run absolutely everything? Or are we going to return to a model like the one we had into the 70s, where a CEO's job wasn't just to maximize shareholder value, but was also to balance the interests of employees, the communities where employees live, customers and suppliers, and to find a way to serve the interests of all of those constituencies. And right now, we've begun the process of changing that. We should see it through. We should recognize this is a great opportunity. I'm so proud of the people in these demonstrations for wearing masks and for being peaceful and not backing down. It's a beautiful thing.
Well, Roger, I'm very grateful to you for your expertise and for your commitment and for all that you're doing and are going to continue to do.
Scott, I really want to thank you for letting me be part of the Sun Valley Writers Conference. I look at the list of speakers and it's like, I'm a heavy reader and all these people that I revere, and I think to myself, what am I doing here? But it's such an honor, such a privilege. And to all the folks at the Sun Valley Writers Conference, thank you for the opportunity. And for all of those who are listening to this, just remember that this is our moment, that Future's going to look back on this time and say, this is when history was made. And all of us have a role to play in that, and I hope we play it.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Beyond the Page. You can catch previous podcast episodes, as well as installments of SVWC Now, our series of video conversations, at lithub.com or at the Sun Valley Writers Conference website, svwc.com. Stay safe, everybody. I'm John Burnham Schwartz. Thanks so much for listening.
Beyond the Page is produced by John Burnham Schwartz and James Tooley. Original music by Dean Grinsfelder and production support provided by Jay Shilliday and the Network Studios.